Jake Martinez stood at his post near the massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber and watched the most important beings in known space argue about words on a screen. His black uniform made him nearly invisible against the dark walls, and that was exactly how the aliens liked it. Humans were supposed to be seen only when needed and forgotten as soon as possible. The chamber itself was a wonder that still took his breath away after 3 years of working security here. The ceiling stretched up so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top, and the walls curved in impossible ways that hurt human eyes to follow. 12 different species had built this place together, and each had added something that made no sense to anyone else. The result was beautiful and confusing at the same time. Ambassador Xyloth stood at the center podium speaking in her musical voice about trade routes and territorial boundaries. Her skin was the color of a clear blue sky, which Jake had learned meant she was focused and confident. The Veltar were strange beings who looked like they were made of living crystal but moved with the grace of dancers. Their emotions showed in the colors that flowed across their translucent skin like aurora lights. Jake had been watching Xyloth for weeks now as she worked to bring peace between the Korthax Republic and the Nexian Collective. 2 species that had been shooting at each other for 30 years and showed no signs of wanting to stop. The border wars had killed millions and turned 3 star systems into graveyards of broken ships and dead worlds. The Korthax Delegate General Thrak sat in his hover chair, making low, growling sounds every time Xyloth mentioned territorial concessions. His people looked like walking tanks covered in thick gray armor that was actually their skin. They had conquered half the galaxy through pure stubbornness and the ability to survive in any environment. Thrak's small red eyes never stopped moving as he calculated angles and advantages like the career soldier he was. On the opposite side of the chamber, the Nexian representative Dr. Korvex bent over his data tablets with the obsessive focus his species was famous for. The Nexians looked like tall, thin humans, but their pale skin had a blue tint, and their large black eyes took up most of their faces. They were the galaxy's greatest scientists and doctors, but they had a habit of overthinking everything until simple problems became impossible puzzles. Jake's partner, Amy Davis, stood at the opposite door watching the crowd with the same bored expression she wore to every diplomatic meeting. She had been doing security work longer than Jake and had seen enough alien politics to know that nothing important ever got decided in these formal sessions. The real deals were made in private rooms over meals that would poison most species. Lieutenant Chris Thompson monitored the security feeds from his station in the corner, where banks of screens showed every angle of the chamber and the corridors beyond. His job was to watch for threats, but after 3 years, the biggest danger they had faced was an elderly Centaurian delegate who got lost looking for the bathroom. The other species present were mostly observers who would vote on the final treaty but had no real say in the negotiations. Jake could identify most of them by now, even though their names were impossible for human tongues to pronounce. There were the insect-like Zephyrians, who communicated by changing the patterns on their wings, and the gaseous Etherians, who had to wear containment suits to interact with solid beings. The humans were outnumbered 1,000 to 1 in this room, but Jake had stopped feeling intimidated by that long ago. Most of these species barely noticed humans existed, and those who did considered them a minor curiosity at best. Humans had only been part of the galactic community for 50 years, and were still seen as primitive newcomers who were useful for manual labor and not much else. Jake checked his atmospheric readings out of habit, and noted that the chamber's environmental systems were working harder than usual to maintain the precise mix of gases needed to keep 12 different species breathing comfortably. The Veltar needed more oxygen than most, while the Korthax preferred higher carbon dioxide levels, and the Nexians required trace amounts of argon to think clearly. Xyloth was explaining the proposed boundary changes using a holographic display that showed the disputed systems in glowing detail. Her skin had shifted to a deeper blue with flecks of silver, which Jake knew meant she was getting passionate about her subject. The Veltar were natural diplomats because their emotions were impossible to hide, but that also made them vulnerable in negotiations with species who had learned to read their color changes. General Thrak interrupted with a harsh bark that the universal translator rendered as a complaint about mining rights in the Kepler system. His massive fists clenched and unclenched as he spoke, which made the human guards tense up, despite knowing that violence in the council chamber would trigger security measures that could stun a battleship. Dr. Korvex responded with a lengthy analysis of resource distribution that included enough statistics to make Jake's head spin. The Nexian spoke in precise mathematical terms, as if the lives of billions of beings could be reduced to equations and probability matrices. His pale fingers danced over his data tablets, pulling up charts and graphs that meant nothing to anyone who wasn't a trained scientist. The debate continued for hours, with each species presenting their positions in ways that reflected their fundamental nature. The Korthax saw everything in terms of strength and territory, while the Nexians approached every problem as a research project that could be solved with enough data. The other observers asked technical questions or raised minor points that showed they were paying attention without taking sides. Jake found himself watching Xyleth more than the others because her color changes gave him advance warning of where the negotiations were heading. When her skin turned yellow, he knew she was about to make a concession, and when it shifted to orange, she was preparing to stand firm on an important point. Right now, she was a steady blue with occasional flickers of green, which meant she was optimistic but cautious. The chamber's lighting dimmed slightly as the station's day cycle shifted toward evening, but the negotiations continued without pause. These beings had traveled from across the galaxy for this meeting, and they would not stop until they had either reached an agreement or admitted failure. Jake hoped it would be the former, because another war would mean more human colonies caught in the crossfire. Amy caught his eye and tapped her wrist to indicate that their shift was supposed to end in an hour, but Jake knew they would be staying late tonight. The security team always remained at their posts during important sessions, even if it meant working double shifts. The pay was good, and the experience of watching galactic history being made was worth the tired feet and stiff backs. Chris reported over their private channel that all security systems were green and the corridors were clear of unauthorized personnel. The station's AI was monitoring every conversation and movement, but Jake trusted his human instincts more than any computer program. Something felt different about tonight's session, though he could not put his finger on what it was. Xyleth raised her hand for silence, and the chamber grew quiet as she prepared to present what everyone hoped would be the final terms of the peace treaty. Xyleth opened her mouth to speak, and then stopped mid-word, as if someone had cut her voice with a knife. Her crystal skin began to flicker between colors too fast for Jake to follow, and she pressed one delicate hand against her chest where her heart would be if Veltar anatomy was anything like human anatomy. The ambassador tried to continue speaking, but only harsh whispers came out instead of her usual musical voice. Her skin was now cycling through red and purple and yellow in rapid succession like a broken hologram. Jake had never seen a Veltar display so many colors at once, and from the gasps around the chamber, neither had anyone else. General Thrak was the first to react, and he lurched up from his hoverchair with surprising speed for something so massive. His armored hand moved toward the weapon at his side, but stopped when he realized there was no enemy to fight. Dr. Korvex stood up more slowly, his large black eyes fixed on Xyleth with the intense focus of a scientist observing an unexpected phenomenon. Xyleth swayed on her feet, and her color changes became even more chaotic. Now her skin was flashing between pale white and deep black, with occasional bursts of colors that had no names in any human language. She made a sound like crystal wind chimes being shattered and collapsed to the polished floor with a crash that echoed through the chamber. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Alien voices rose in dozens of languages, while the universal translators struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations. Security alarms began wailing as the chamber's monitoring systems detected a medical emergency. Emergency lights bathed everything in harsh red that made the alien delegates look even more strange and threatening. Dr. Korvex reached Xyloth first and pulled out a medical scanner that looked like a silver briefcase covered in blinking lights. He ran the device over her motionless form while muttering in the rapid clicking language his species used when they were thinking hard. Other Nexian medical staff rushed into the chamber carrying equipment that Jake could not begin to identify. Jake stepped forward from his post, but Amy grabbed his arm and shook her head. Human security was not supposed to interfere in alien medical situations unless specifically requested. Their job was to maintain order and keep unauthorized personnel away from the scene. Still, Jake found himself studying Xyloth's condition with the same attention he had learned to apply to any emergency situation. The Veltar ambassador's skin was now pulsing between stark white and absolute black, in a rhythm that reminded Jake of a failing heartbeat. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, but at least she was still breathing. Her crystalline features looked fragile as glass, and Jake worried that the wrong movement might shatter her completely. General Thrak was shouting accusations in his harsh voice, claiming that someone had poisoned the ambassador. His red eyes swept, the chamber looking for enemies while his massive hands clenched into fists that could probably punch through steel. The other Korthax delegates formed a protective circle around their general ready for battle, even though there was no one to fight. The Nexian medical team worked with efficient precision running scanners and injecting substances into Xyloth's arm through devices that looked more like torture instruments than medical equipment. Dr. Korvex barked orders in his own language while his pale fingers danced over diagnostic displays that meant nothing to Jake, but apparently told the doctor that his patient was in serious trouble. Other species began evacuating their delegates as security protocols kicked in. The Zephyrians fluttered their wings in patterns that Jake recognized as distress signals, while the Etherians began dispersing into their component gases despite the risk to their containment suits. The chamber that had been filled with hope just minutes ago now reeked of fear and suspicion. Chris Thompson's voice crackled over the security channel, reporting that station sensors had detected no toxic substances in the air and no energy weapons had been fired. Whatever was happening to Xyloth, it was not an obvious attack, which made the situation even more frightening. An enemy you could see and fight was bad enough, but an invisible threat could strike anyone at any time. Jake found himself studying the environmental readings on his basic scanner, not because he thought it would help, but because he needed something to focus on other than the chaos around him. The atmospheric composition showed normal levels of oxygen, nitrogen, and the trace gases needed to keep the various species comfortable. Nothing seemed wrong with the air they were all breathing. Amy was coordinating with station security to seal the chamber and prevent anyone from leaving until they knew what had caused Xyloth's collapse. If this was some kind of attack, the perpetrator might still be in the room and could strike again at any moment. Her calm, professional voice was a welcome contrast to the alien shouts and electronic wailing of medical equipment. Dr. Korvex stood up from his patient and announced to the chamber that Xyloth was alive, but her condition was deteriorating rapidly. He had never seen symptoms like these in any Veltar medical textbook, and his equipment was not designed to handle whatever was happening to her unique physiology. The translator made his clinical words sound even more ominous than they probably were in his own language. General Thrak immediately accused the Nexians of using some kind of biological weapon designed to target Veltar genetics. His logic was brutal, but not entirely unreasonable, since the Nexians were the galaxy's most advanced scientists and would be capable of creating such a weapon if they wanted to. Dr. Korvex protested his innocence, but his pale skin flushed darker. Blue, which Jake had learned meant Nexians were either lying or extremely stressed. The Zephyrian observer began broadcasting wing patterns that the translator interpreted as suggestions that everyone leave the chamber immediately, in case whatever was affecting Xyloth was contagious. The insect beings were paranoid about biological contamination ever since a plague had wiped out 3 of their colony worlds 2 centuries ago. Their fear was understandable, but evacuation would end any chance of continuing the peace negotiations. Jake watched the medical team work and noticed things that probably meant nothing but seemed worth remembering anyway. Xyloth's breathing pattern was irregular but followed a cycle that repeated every 30 seconds. Her color changes had slowed down but were still more dramatic than anything he had seen from a healthy Veltar. Her body temperature seemed to be dropping based on the frost that was forming around the edges of her crystalline skin. The Etherian delegate made a suggestion through his voice synthesizer that perhaps the chamber's environmental systems had malfunctioned and were poisoning the air. It was a reasonable theory, but station diagnostics showed all systems operating normally. The air mixture was exactly what it should be for a mixed species gathering, and no contamination had been detected by any of the sophisticated monitoring equipment. Amy reported that the chamber was now sealed, and no one would be allowed to enter or leave until the medical emergency was resolved. She had also requested backup from the human security teams on other levels in case the situation got worse. Jake appreciated her thoroughness, but hoped the extra personnel would not be needed. Chris continued monitoring the security feeds and reported that crowds were gathering outside the chamber as news of the ambassador's collapse spread through the station. Representatives from a dozen species wanted to know what was happening to their peace negotiations and whether their own delegates were safe. The station's command staff was fielding calls from governments across the galaxy demanding answers that no one had yet. Dr. Corvex tried several different treatments, but nothing seemed to help Xyloth's condition. If anything, she appeared to be getting worse as her skin continued its unnatural pulsing between white and black. Her breathing became even more labored, and the frost around her body began spreading across the floor like a crystalline infection. Jake found himself wishing he knew more about Veltar physiology, but humans had only been studying alien biology for 50 years, and most of what they knew came from medical texts written by the aliens themselves. The Veltar were particularly secretive about their internal anatomy, claiming that such knowledge was sacred to their people and not meant for outsiders. The chamber fell into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the sounds of medical equipment and Xyloth's struggling breath. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something to happen, but no one knew what that something might be. The peace negotiations that had brought them all together now seemed less important than the life of the being who had been trying to make them possible. Jake kept staring at his environmental scanner even though he had checked the readings a dozen times already. Something was bothering him about the numbers, but he could not figure out what it was. The oxygen levels were normal and the nitrogen was where it should be, and all the trace gases needed by the different species were within acceptable ranges. Then he noticed something that made him look more carefully at the display. The carbon dioxide level had been slowly climbing for the past hour. It was still within safe limits for most species, but it was definitely higher than it had been when the session started. Jake frowned and checked his scanner's memory to confirm what he was seeing. The CO2 level had risen from 0.03% to 0.04% over the course of the evening. That was not dangerous for humans or most other species, but Jake remembered reading something about Veltar physiology during his security training. Their crystal-based biology was extremely sensitive to atmospheric chemistry in ways that carbon-based life forms were not. Jake looked at Xyloth's motionless form and then at his scanner again. Could something so simple be causing her collapse, while all the sophisticated alien medical equipment missed it completely? It seemed impossible, but Jake had learned that the most obvious explanations were often the correct ones, even when dealing with advanced alien technology. He walked toward the cluster of medical personnel working around Xyloth, but Dr. Corvex waved him away without looking up from his instruments. The Nexian doctor was focused on complex biological scans and chemical analyses that went far beyond anything a human security guard could understand. Jake tried to speak, but Corvex cut Him off with an impatient gesture, Amy noticed Jake's behavior and moved closer to him with a questioning look. Jake showed her his scanner readings and pointed to the slowly climbing CO2 numbers. Amy understood immediately because she had also read the security briefings about alien physiological vulnerabilities. Her eyes widened as she realized what Jake was thinking. The two humans approached Dr. Korvex again, and this time Amy used her authority as senior security officer to demand his attention. The Nexian doctor looked annoyed at being interrupted, but he stopped working long enough to listen to what they had to say. Jake showed him the atmospheric readings and explained his theory about carbon dioxide poisoning. Dr. Korvex glanced at the scanner display and shook his head dismissively. He pointed to his own much more sophisticated medical equipment and explained that he was monitoring dozens of biological markers and chemical indicators that were far more advanced than anything humans could detect. If there was something wrong with the air, his instruments would have found it already. Jake persisted and pulled up everything he could remember about Veltar biology on his personal datapad. The information was limited because the Veltar kept most of their medical knowledge secret, but there were a few references to their sensitivity to atmospheric composition. Their crystalline cellular structure required precise gas ratios to function properly, and even small changes could cause serious problems. General Thrak overheard the conversation and stomped over to demand an explanation. The massive Korthax warrior looked down at Jake with his small red eyes and growled something that the translator rendered as a question about human competence. Thrak made it clear that he thought humans were too primitive to understand what was happening to a sophisticated being like Xyloth. Jake ignored the insult and continued studying his readings. The CO2 level was still climbing slowly but steadily. It was now at 0.045%, which was getting close to the upper limits that some species could tolerate. More importantly, it was well above the levels that Veltar physiology was designed to handle according to the limited information in the security database. Amy contacted Chris Thompson and asked him to check the environmental systems from his security station. Chris reported that all automated systems showed green status, and the air recycling equipment was functioning normally. The chamber's atmosphere was being maintained exactly according to the specifications programmed into the station's computers. Jake realized that the problem might not be with the environmental systems themselves, but with the way they were calibrated. The chamber was designed to accommodate 12 different species with different atmospheric needs. The computers tried to find a balance that would keep everyone comfortable, but they might not account for the unique sensitivity of Veltar biology. He asked Chris to manually override the atmospheric controls and increase the air circulation in the chamber. Chris hesitated because tampering with life support systems without authorization was against regulations, but Amy backed up Jake's request. She ordered Chris to make the changes immediately and worry about the paperwork later. Jake watched his scanner as the ventilation fans increased their speed and began pulling more air through the chamber's recycling systems. The CO2 levels started dropping almost immediately as fresh air was pumped in from the station's reserves. Within minutes, the numbers on his display were moving back toward the normal range. Dr. Korvex was still focused on his medical scans and did not notice the environmental changes at first. He was running tests for exotic toxins and rare diseases, while completely ignoring the simple possibility that Xyloth was being slowly poisoned by the very air she was breathing. His sophisticated equipment was designed to detect complex threats, not basic atmospheric problems. Jake knelt down next to Xyloth and watched her face for any signs of improvement. Her crystalline skin was still pulsing between white and black, but the rhythm seemed to be slowing down slightly. Her breathing was still labored, but not getting worse. It was hard to tell if the changes in ventilation were helping, but at least she did not seem to be deteriorating further. Amy coordinated with Chris to monitor the atmospheric readings from multiple sensors throughout the chamber. They wanted to make sure the CO2 levels dropped evenly and did not create pockets of stale air that might continue to affect Xyloth's condition. The human security team worked together with the efficiency that came from years of training and experience. General Thrak watched their activities with growing interest. The Korthax warrior was not stupid, despite his preference for direct action, over subtle thinking. He could see that the humans were doing something different from the alien medical team, and he wanted to know if their approach might actually work. His people respected practical solutions even when they came from unexpected sources. Dr. Korvax finally noticed that the atmospheric readings on his own equipment were changing. His pale face showed confusion as he tried to understand why the air composition was shifting during a medical emergency. He looked at Jake's scanner and then at his own instruments as he began to realize what the humans had discovered. The Nexian doctor's expression changed from dismissive annoyance to reluctant respect as he understood the implications of what Jake had figured out. His sophisticated medical scanners had been looking for complex biological threats while missing the simple environmental factor that was killing his patient. It was exactly the kind of oversight that could happen when brilliant minds focused too narrowly on their area of expertise. Jake continued monitoring the CO2 levels as they dropped toward the normal range. He also watched Xyloth's color changes, which seemed to be becoming less chaotic as the air quality improved. The stark white and black pulsing was gradually giving way to more normal Veltar colors, including occasional flickers of pale blue. That might indicate she was starting to recover consciousness. Amy reported to Station Command that the human security team had identified a possible cause for the ambassador's collapse and had taken corrective action. She requested that environmental engineers examine the chamber's atmospheric systems to determine why the CO2 buildup had not been detected by the automated monitoring equipment. Chris confirmed that the ventilation changes were having the desired effect throughout the chamber. The atmospheric composition was now much closer to optimal levels for all species present, including the delicate requirements of Veltar physiology. He also noted that several other delegates seemed to be breathing more easily now that the air quality had improved. Jake felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as he watched Xyloth's condition. If his theory was correct, then she should start showing signs of recovery as the CO2 levels normalized. If he was wrong, then they had wasted precious time while her real condition continued to deteriorate. Either way, they would know soon enough. Whether a human security guard's simple observation had solved a mystery that had baffled the galaxy's best medical minds. The change was subtle at first, but Jake could see it happening in real time on his scanner display. As the carbon dioxide levels dropped below 0.04%, Xyloth's skin began to stabilize. The chaotic flashing between white and black slowed down and started showing more organized patterns. Her breathing became deeper and more regular. Dr. Korvax noticed the improvement at the same time, and his large black eyes widened with surprise. He ran his medical scanner over Xyloth again and found that her vital signs were strengthening. Her body temperature was rising back toward normal levels, and the frost that had been forming around her crystalline features began to melt away. General. Thrak leaned forward in his hover chair to get a better view of what was happening. The massive Korthax warrior had seen enough battlefield medicine to recognize when a patient was recovering from what had seemed like certain death. His small red eyes fixed on Jake with an expression that might have been respect if such a thing was possible from a species that considered humans barely worth noticing. Xyloth's skin shifted to a pale green color that Jake recognized as the Veltar equivalent of confusion. Her large silver eyes opened slowly, and she tried to sit up, but Dr. Korvax gently pressed her back down while he continued his medical scans. She spoke in a weak voice, asking what had happened to her and why she felt so strange. Jake explained his theory about the carbon dioxide buildup, while Amy showed the atmospheric readings to anyone who wanted to see them. The numbers told a clear story of slowly rising CO2 levels that had been poisoning the chamber's most sensitive occupant while everyone else remained unaffected. The solution had been as simple as turning up the ventilation fans. Dr. Korvax ran additional tests to confirm Jake's diagnosis and found that Xyloth's blood chemistry showed clear signs of carbon dioxide poisoning. Her crystalline cellular structure had been unable to process the elevated CO2 levels and had begun shutting down to protect itself from further damage. Without the human's intervention, she would have died within another hour. The Nexian doctor looked embarrassed as he admitted that his sophisticated medical equipment had been calibrated to detect biological and chemical threats, but not basics, atmospheric problems. His scanners could identify exotic toxins and rare diseases, but had completely missed the simple environmental factor that was killing his patient. It was a humbling reminder that advanced technology was not always superior to basic observation. Xyloth sat up slowly with Dr. Korvex's help, and her skin showed the warm golden color that indicated gratitude among her people. She looked directly at Jake and thanked him in her musical voice for saving her life. She explained that Veltar physiology was indeed extremely sensitive to atmospheric composition, and that even small changes in gas ratios could be fatal to her species. The ambassador went on to describe how her people had evolved on a world with very stable atmospheric conditions and had never developed the tolerance for environmental variations that most other species took for granted. Their crystalline biology was like a living sensor that reflected the precise chemical composition of the air around them. Her color changes during the collapse had been her body's desperate attempt to warn others that something was wrong. General Thrak stood up from his chair and walked over to Jake with heavy footsteps that echoed through the chamber. The Korthax. General was twice as tall as any human and probably weighed as much as a small vehicle, but he moved with surprising grace. He stopped in front of Jake and spoke in his harsh voice with words that the translator rendered as a formal acknowledgement of debt. The general explained that his people valued practical wisdom above all other qualities, and that Jake had demonstrated exactly the kind of clear thinking that Korthak's culture respected. He admitted that he had been wrong to dismiss human capabilities and said that any species clever enough to solve problems that baffled their supposed superiors deserved to be taken seriously in galactic affairs. Dr. Korvex also offered his apologies for initially dismissing Jake's observations. The Nexian scientist said that his people had a tendency to overcomplicate problems and look for complex solutions when simple ones would work better. He acknowledged that the humans' comprehensive approach to environmental monitoring had detected something that his specialized medical equipment had missed completely. Xyloth asked Jake to explain how he had figured out what was wrong when the galaxy's most advanced medical technology had failed to identify the problem. Jake showed her his basic atmospheric scanner and described how human security protocols required constant monitoring of environmental conditions to keep their people safe in alien environments. The ambassador was fascinated to learn that humans had developed such thorough environmental awareness because they could not take atmospheric safety for granted the way most species did. Their need to survive in hostile conditions had forced them to pay attention to basic factors that other beings ignored. What seemed like primitive caution was actually sophisticated survival thinking. Amy reported that the chamber's environmental systems had been adjusted to maintain better atmospheric balance for future mixed species gatherings. The station's engineers were reviewing the monitoring protocols to ensure that similar problems would be detected automatically before they could threaten anyone's life. The incident would become a case study in the importance of comprehensive environmental management. Chris Thompson confirmed that all atmospheric readings were now within optimal ranges for every species present in the chamber. The CO2 levels had stabilized at 0.03%, which was perfect for Veltar physiology while remaining comfortable for everyone else. His security monitors showed that the crowds outside the chamber were dispersing as word spread that the crisis had been resolved. Xyloth stood up carefully and tested her balance, while Dr. Korvex continued monitoring her vital signs. Her skin showed healthy blue and silver patterns that indicated she was feeling strong enough to continue with her diplomatic duties. She announced to the chamber that she was ready to resume the peace negotiations if the other delegates were willing. General Thrak immediately agreed and said that any treaty negotiated under such circumstances would be blessed by the gods of war and wisdom. His people believed that surviving shared danger created bonds of trust that could not be broken by political disagreements. The fact that a human had saved their mediator's life added weight to his words. Dr. Korvex also expressed his support for continuing the negotiations and suggested that the incident had demonstrated the value of cooperation between different species with different strengths. The Nexians' scientific knowledge combined with human practical wisdom and Korthak's determination could solve problems that none of them could handle alone. The other delegates began returning to their seats as the medical equipment was cleared away and the chamber returned to normal lighting. The emergency was over, but the mood in the room had changed completely. Instead of suspicion and rivalry, there was now a sense of shared purpose that had not existed before Xyleth's collapse. Jake returned to his security post, but found that he was no longer invisible to the alien delegates. Several of them nodded respectfully as he passed, and a few even spoke brief words of acknowledgement. For the first time since humans had joined the galactic community, he felt like an equal participant rather than a barely tolerated observer. Amy and Chris also received recognition for their quick thinking and professional response to the crisis. The human security team had worked together seamlessly to identify and solve a problem that could have derailed the most important peace negotiations in galactic history. Their success would be remembered long after the specific details of the treaty were forgotten. Xyleth called for order and prepared to continue with the negotiations. Her skin showed the confident blue color that meant she was ready to tackle the difficult work of building lasting peace between former enemies. The Kepler Accords would now have a foundation of mutual respect that had been forged in crisis and proven by cooperation across species lines. 3 hours later, the Kepler Accords were signed with ceremonies that would be remembered across the galaxy for generations. Xyleth's skin glowed with the warm golden color of deep satisfaction as she watched representatives from 12 species put their marks on the treaty that would end 30 years of warfare. The peace agreement was more comprehensive than anyone had dared hope, and included provisions for cooperation that went far beyond simple ceasefire terms. Jake stood at his post watching the historic moment unfold and still could not quite believe what had happened. A few hours ago, he had been just another human security guard doing his job and trying to stay invisible. Now he found himself at the center of events that would shape the future of interstellar relations. The simple act of checking his atmospheric scanner had changed everything. General Thrak was the first to sign the treaty, and he did so with the kind of flourish that his people reserved for truly momentous occasions. As he finished writing his name in the flowing script of his warrior culture, he looked directly at Jake and spoke loud enough for the entire chamber to hear. The translator rendered his words as a formal declaration that the Korthax Republic would always honor the human who had saved these negotiations. Dr. Korvex signed next with the precise mathematical symbols that Nexians used for legal documents. His pale hands moved carefully across the treaty surface as he added the chemical formulas that represented his species' commitment to the peace process. When he finished, he also acknowledged Jake's contribution and promised that Nexian medical schools would study the incident as an example of the value of comprehensive thinking over narrow specialization. The other species added their signatures in turn, using methods ranging from bioluminescent patterns to controlled plasma discharges. Each delegate took time to recognize the role that human observation had played in making the treaty possible. What had started as a security emergency had become a demonstration of the unique value that every species brought to the galactic community. Xyleth was the last to sign, and she did so with a stylus that left traces of crystalline material embedded in the treaty surface. Her mark would glow with soft light for centuries as a permanent reminder of the Veltar commitment to peace. As she finished writing, she announced that she was requesting a formal change to the treaty protocols that would require human environmental monitoring at all future diplomatic gatherings. The ambassador explained her reasoning to the assembled delegates in her musical voice that now carried new authority after her near-death experience. She pointed out that the galaxy's most sophisticated civilizations had failed to notice a simple problem that could have killed her and destroyed the peace process. Human attention to basic survival factors had proven more valuable than all their advanced technology. Jake felt overwhelmed as he realized that Xylath's proposal meant humans would no longer be relegated to simple security duties at galactic gatherings. They would be recognized as essential partners whose unique perspective could prevent disasters that no one else would see coming. It was more respect than his species had ever received from the galactic community. Amy and Chris joined, Jake at the front of the chamber as Xylath called for the human security team to be formally recognized. The three humans walked forward, feeling awkward in their simple uniforms, while surrounded by beings whose clothing was worth more than most human colonies could afford. But the respect in the aliens' eyes made up for any embarrassment about their appearance. General Thrak announced that the Korthax Republic was offering Jake a position as environmental liaison to their military command.